On February 19, 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood in the Tunisian desert and watched American soldiers run. His Afrika Korps had torn through their positions at Kasserine Pass like a blade through paper. Tanks abandoned in the sand. Artillery pieces captured before their crews could fire a single round. Entire battalions scattered across 50 miles of chaotic retreat. 6,500 American casualties in just 6 days, including 3,000 captured. Rommel wrote to his wife that night, with something approaching satisfaction. The Americans, he noted, had not yet learned how to fight. 3,000 miles away, in a prisoner-of-war camp outside London, a German general named Günther Blumentritt would later sit across from British military historian Basil Liddell Hart and deliver a very different verdict. "We regarded General Patton extremely highly," Blumentritt said, "as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, a man of incredible initiative and lightning-like action. His operations impressed us enormously, probably because he came closest to our own concept of the classical military commander. He even improved on Napoleon's basic tenet of speed and more speed." Rommel believed the Americans were amateurs. Blumentritt knew they had become something far more dangerous. The journey between those two assessments, between contempt and fear, reveals one of the most remarkable military transformations in modern history. It explains why German soldiers who faced British, Canadian, and American forces came to describe each enemy in fundamentally different terms. The British they called professional and methodical, the Canadians they called ruthless, but the Americans they described with words that carried a different weight entirely: overwhelming, unpredictable, relentless, and above all, terrifying in their firepower. This is the story of how German soldiers learned to fear American infantry, and why they never felt quite the same way about anyone else. The German confidence that shattered at Kasserine had deep roots stretching back decades. In the years before America entered the war, German military intelligence compiled detailed assessments of American fighting capacity. The conclusions were remarkably consistent across every analyst and every report. The United States Army, in 1939, ranked 19th in the world in total size, smaller than the armies of Portugal and Romania. American factories produced automobiles and washing machines, not tanks and artillery pieces. The nation had not fought a major war in over 2 decades. Its soldiers were soft, its officers inexperienced, its population divided by class and ethnicity and political disagreement. Nazi ideology reinforced these conclusions with the weight of supposed racial science. Adolf Hitler believed that national strength flowed from racial purity and cultural homogeneity. Germany, with its supposed Aryan bloodline, possessed an inherent martial superiority that would manifest on every battlefield. America, a mongrel nation of immigrants from every corner of the globe, could not possibly match the fighting spirit of the German soldier. Hitler told his inner circle that he did not see much future for the Americans. "Everything about American society," he said, "revealed fundamental weaknesses. How could one expect such a state to hold together under the terrible pressure of modern industrial war?" The memory of the First World War seemed to confirm these prejudices. American troops had arrived in France in 1917 and performed adequately in the final campaigns, but they had entered late, suffered relatively light casualties compared to the European powers, and contributed little to the strategic direction of the conflict. German officers who had faced those green doughboys in the Meuse-Argonne remembered them as enthusiastic but undisciplined, brave but tactically naive, willing to attack frontally but unable to sustain complex operations. The idea that their sons would be fundamentally different seemed implausible to men who had spent their entire careers studying the art of war. When American forces finally met the Wehrmacht in combat at Kasserine Pass, every German assumption appeared completely vindicated. Major General Lloyd Fredendall commanded the American Second Corps with spectacular incompetence that would later become a case study in military academies worldwide. He dispersed his forces across a 30-mile front, leaving units isolated and unable to support each other. He positioned his headquarters in an elaborate bunker carved into a mountainside 70 miles behind the lines, far from the fighting he was supposed to direct. His orders were confused, his communications poor, his grasp of the tactical situation almost non-existent. Engineers who should have been preparing defensive positions were instead excavating his underground command post. His troops had trained for months in England and North Africa, but training exercises and actual combat are fundamentally different experiences. Many replacements had arrived only days before the battle, some without completing their basic training. Rommel struck on February 14, 1943, with the confidence of a commander who had spent 2 years defeating British forces across the North African desert. His panzers rolled through gaps in the American line that should never have existed. Artillery positions were overrun before they could fire effective salvos. Infantry units broke and fled without orders, abandoning equipment worth millions of dollars in the desert sand. American tanks, caught in the open without infantry support, burned under the accurate fire of German 88mm guns that had already earned a fearsome reputation. The retreat became a rout that spread panic through the American rear areas. Officers lost contact with their men in the confusion. Units that should have supported each other fought in isolation and were destroyed in detail by concentrated German forces. Prisoners by the thousands marched into German captivity, stunned by the speed and completeness of their defeat. Omar Bradley, who would later command the largest American force in history during the invasion of France, called Kasserine probably the worst performance of United States Army troops in their whole proud history. The assessment was harsh but not unfair. Everything that could go wrong had gone wrong. Leadership had failed at every level. Coordination between units had collapsed. The tactical proficiency that comes only from experience was completely absent. German commanders drew the obvious conclusions from this catastrophe. The Americans lacked the hardness and cohesion required for sustained combat against professional soldiers who had been fighting for years. Their material abundance could not compensate for their tactical incompetence and poor leadership. Their diverse population produced soldiers without the cohesion or fighting spirit that came from shared national identity. Rommel wrote that the Americans would require months, perhaps years, to develop into serious opponents worth respecting. Other German generals were less generous in their private assessments. They expected that future encounters would produce similar results with similar ease. But Rommel was too intelligent and too experienced a commander to let first impressions harden into permanent assumptions. He had made that mistake before in the desert, underestimating the British in the early campaigns before learning to respect their tenacity and professional skill. In the days following Kasserine, something caught his attention that did not fit his expectations. The Americans were not behaving the way defeated armies usually behaved. They were not demoralized and passive. They were not waiting for someone else to solve their problems. They were reorganizing with a speed that seemed almost unnatural, as if the defeat had awakened something rather than broken their spirit. Within weeks of the disaster, everything changed in ways that should have alarmed German intelligence officers. Dwight Eisenhower relieved Fredendall and sent George Patton to take command of Second Corps. Patton descended on the demoralized formation like a force of nature, a tornado of energy and fury and absolute demand for excellence that transformed the atmosphere overnight. He demanded discipline with an intensity that bordered on mania. Soldiers who had slouched through the disaster at Kasserine found themselves standing at attention, polishing brass, wearing their helmets and neckties at all times, and training harder than they had ever trained in their lives. Patton personally fined officers who appeared without proper uniform. He threatened to court-martial anyone who showed cowardice under fire. He was profane, theatrical, and absolutely uncompromising in his standards. He drove his men relentlessly because he understood something that Rommel was only beginning to suspect. The Americans who broke at Kasserine were not yet soldiers. They could become soldiers, and they would become soldiers faster than anyone in the German high command believed possible. The transformation revealed itself with shocking clarity at El Guettar on March 23, 1943. Barely 4 weeks after the Kasserine debacle ended, Patton positioned his forces across the approaches to the vital pass and prepared defensive positions with care that had been absent in February. He waited for the inevitable German counterattack with confidence rather than anxiety. When 50 tanks of the 10th Panzer Division rolled forward that morning through the morning mist, their crews expected to scatter the Americans as easily as they had at Kasserine. They advanced with the casual confidence of men who had beaten this enemy before and saw no reason to expect different results. They were catastrophically wrong. American mines disabled the lead panzers, blocking the narrow approach and channeling the following vehicles into killing zones. Tank destroyers opened fire from concealed positions with accuracy that surprised the German crews. Infantry held their ground with discipline that had been absent 4 weeks earlier, firing with accuracy and maintaining unit cohesion under pressure. And then the artillery began its terrible work. What the Germans encountered at El Guettar was something entirely new, something that would define American ground combat for the remainder of the war in ways they could not yet understand. Not just more guns, though the Americans certainly had more guns than they had possessed at Kasserine. Something systematic, something coordinated in ways that German artillery had never achieved. Something that seemed to erase the distance between the forward observer calling in targets and the shells exploding among German tanks and infantry. The bombardment that fell on 10th Panzer Division that morning was not the scattered fire of individual batteries working independently according to their own assessments. It was a concentrated storm of steel that seemed to come from everywhere at once, adjusted with speed and accuracy that German artillerists found difficult to comprehend. The German attack shattered against American positions that held firm throughout the day. 30 tanks were left burning or disabled on the approach to the pass, their crews dead or captured. Infantry caught in the open were pinned and slaughtered by massed artillery fire that followed them as they tried to withdraw. Prisoners were taken by the hundreds, their confidence visibly broken by what they had experienced. When captured, German soldiers were interrogated afterward. Some of them wept openly. They told their American captors that this was the first time in the entire war they had ever been stopped by mere artillery and infantry without significant armor support. Major General Terry Allen, commanding the 1st Infantry Division, had vowed that he would never pull back and would shoot the first man who did. He did not have to carry out the threat. His soldiers stood and fought with the ferocity of men who had something to prove to themselves and to the enemy who had humiliated them. The paradox of Kasserine was that it gave the Germans a false sense of security, precisely when they should have been most alarmed about American potential. Rommel and his fellow commanders had seen the Americans at their absolute worst moment. They assumed they had seen the Americans at their normal level of capability. They did not understand that they were watching a learning organization in the early stages of an extraordinarily rapid process of adaptation and improvement. The army that fled at Kasserine was not the army that would invade Sicily in July. It was not the army that would storm the beaches of Normandy the following year. It was not even the army that would finish the Tunisian campaign 3 months later. By May of 1943, the war in North Africa was over. 275,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered to Allied forces in Tunisia, roughly 3 times more prisoners than the Soviets had taken at Stalingrad. The Americans, who had panicked under Rommel's first blow, were now among the victors, accepting German surrenders and processing captured equipment. German intelligence officers who analyzed the campaign in their after-action reports struggled to explain what had happened. The Americans had been routed in February. By May, they were conducting offensive operations with skill and aggression that rivaled veteran formations with years of combat experience. The speed of the improvement defied every model German planners possessed for estimating enemy capabilities. Rommel himself understood better than most what he had witnessed in those final months of the African campaign. In a passage from his papers that would be published after the war, he wrote with unusual candor about his former opponents in Tunisia. The Americans had to pay a stiff price for their experience, but it brought rich dividends. Even at that time, the American generals showed themselves to be very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces, although we had to wait until the Patton Army in France to see the most astonishing achievements in mobile warfare. The man who had dismissed American soldiers as hopeless amateurs in February was predicting their future mastery by spring. What Rommel was witnessing, though he could not fully articulate it in doctrinal terms, was the emergence of a military system unlike anything the Germans had ever faced in their previous campaigns. The individual American soldier might or might not be the equal of his German counterpart in training, motivation, or raw tactical skill, but, Individual skill was only one variable in a complex equation that determined battlefield outcomes. The Americans were building something that multiplied the effectiveness of every rifleman, every tank crew, every artillery battery far beyond what their individual capabilities would suggest. They were building an integrated machine for waging modern industrial warfare. The heart of that machine was the American artillery system, and German soldiers would come to fear American artillery more than any other weapon they faced on the Western Front. German veterans and officers who survived the war consistently identified American artillery as the weapon they feared most, more than tanks with their thick armor and powerful guns, more than the fighter bombers that ruled the daytime skies, more than anything else on the battlefield. The reason was not simply volume of fire, though American guns certainly fired more shells more often than German guns could match. The reason was an entire integrated system of fire control that had no equivalent in any other army in the world, including the vaunted Wehrmacht. The American Fire Direction Center was developed at Fort Sill, Oklahoma during the quiet years between the wars when most nations were cutting their military budgets and paying little attention to artillery innovation. Unlike British or German systems, where forward observers controlled their own batteries through direct communication links and each battery operated somewhat independently, the American system centralized fire control at the battalion level in ways that multiplied effectiveness. Any observer anywhere on the battlefield could call for fire from any battery in range without needing a prior relationship. Fire requests could be passed upward from battalion to division to corps level with remarkable speed, concentrating the guns of an entire army on a single critical target if the situation demanded such concentration. The mathematics of fire control were simplified through mechanical aids and standardized procedures that reduced the time from request to shells on target to approximately 3 minutes. German systems required 10 to 12 minutes to achieve the same result and often could not mass fires from multiple units with the same efficiency. The practical consequences of this time and coordination difference were devastating for German troops who found themselves on the receiving end. A single American observation aircraft, a fragile Piper Cub with fabric covering and no weapons and a top speed barely faster than an automobile, could call down the fire of dozens of guns on any target visible from the air. German soldiers learned to dread the appearance of those tiny aircraft circling overhead. They knew exactly what followed when a Cub began orbiting their position. Within minutes, shells would begin falling with accuracy that seemed almost supernatural in its precision. The observer would adjust fire methodically, walking the bombardment across German positions until nothing remained but craters and corpses and shattered equipment. The Americans perfected a technique called time on target that multiplied the terror of their artillery beyond anything the Germans had experienced in any previous campaign. Batteries of different calibers positioned at varying distances from the target would calculate their firing times with precise coordination so that all shells from all guns arrived simultaneously within a window of just a few seconds. For German soldiers in the impact zone, silence would be shattered by instantaneous saturation with no warning whatsoever. There was no first shell to send men diving for cover before the main barrage began, just sudden, overwhelming destruction appearing from nowhere, as if the sky itself had collapsed on their positions. At Elsenborn Ridge during the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944, this system enabled the massing of 348 artillery pieces against the 6th SS Panzer Army, one of the largest artillery concentrations in the history of warfare up to that time. The concentrated fire broke attack after attack by elite German formations that had expected to sweep aside American resistance with the same contempt they had shown at Kasserine 2 years earlier. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Jugend, composed of fanatical young soldiers who had been indoctrinated since childhood, was decimated trying to advance through that artillery storm. Their tanks burned where they stopped under the rain of shells. Their infantry died in windrows cut down by shrapnel and blast. Their offensive, meant to reach Antwerp and split the Allied armies in two, collapsed within sight of its first-day objectives. The introduction of the proximity fuse for ground combat in December of 1944 added another dimension of horror to American artillery fire that German troops had never encountered. The Americans had invested over $1 billion developing and producing a miniature radar set small enough to fit inside an artillery shell, one of the most ambitious weapons programs of the war after the atomic bomb itself. The fuse detected the ground as the shell descended and triggered detonation at the optimal height for maximum fragmentation effect, typically around 30 feet above the surface for standard field artillery. Shells that would normally have buried themselves in soft ground before exploding, wasting much of their lethal energy, now burst in the air and showered shrapnel downward onto troops in foxholes and trenches that had previously offered reasonable protection. The effect was 5 to 10 times more lethal than conventional artillery fire against dug-in infantry positions. German prisoners captured during the Bulge reported that some soldiers charged directly into American positions rather than endure the airburst artillery. They preferred the chance of being shot in a direct assault to the certainty of being shredded by fragments from above while cowering in their holes. General George Patton wrote to the War Department with undisguised satisfaction about the new weapon and its effects. "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating," he reported in his characteristic direct style. "We caught a German battalion which was trying to get across the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 72. The sheer volume of American ammunition production defied German comprehension and made their own logistical situation seem hopeless by comparison." Battery C of the 337th Field Artillery Battalion fired its 300,000th round between June of 1944 and March of 1945, an output that would have exhausted German ammunition stocks for an entire corps. For the 9th Army's Rhine crossing in March of 1945, 2,700 American guns opened fire at a rate exceeding 1,000 rounds per minute, more than 65,000 shells in a single bombardment that lasted just over an hour. German artillery forced to conserve every shell and using a logistically nightmarish mix of captured guns from across occupied Europe that each required different ammunition could not begin to match this output. General Hans Eberbach, commanding 5th Panzer Army in Normandy, documented in his reports that his artillery included guns manufactured in France, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the Soviet Union in addition to German pieces, each type requiring different ammunition calibers, different spare parts, different maintenance procedures, and different training for the crews. A shell made in one factory would not fit a gun made in another. The Americans, by contrast, standardized everything in their arsenal. A shell manufactured in Ohio would fit a gun assembled in Michigan, being served by a crew trained in Oklahoma. The same industrial logic that Henry Ford had used to revolutionize automobile production now built armies with the same efficiency. The artillery was only one element of the American system, but it illustrated the broader pattern that made American forces so formidable once they reached maturity. Where individual German soldiers might outperform individual American soldiers in small unit engagements and direct firefights, the Americans created force multipliers that magnified the effectiveness of every man in uniform beyond what individual performance would predict. Close air support integrated with ground operations through a system of forward air controllers who could call in fighter bombers within minutes of identifying a target, often faster than German units could react. Every American division was fully motorized with organic truck transport, giving it a mobility that German formations, still dependent on horses for much of their supply transport, could never match in sustained operations. The logistics chain that supported American operations seemed bottomless to German observers. When tanks were destroyed, new tanks arrived within days from depots that never seemed to empty. When ammunition was expended, more ammunition appeared within hours on trucks that kept coming regardless of losses. The flow never stopped and never even seemed to slow. Normandy became the proving ground where these American systems reached their full maturity and demonstrated capabilities that left German survivors permanently shaken. When American forces came ashore on June 6, 1944, they faced immediate tactical challenges that threatened to stall the entire invasion in its first critical weeks. The bocage country inland from the beaches was a nightmare of ancient hedgerows, earthen banks up to 15 feet high, topped with dense vegetation that had accumulated for centuries, and turned every small field into a natural fortress. Tanks could not push through the hedgerows without climbing over them and exposing their thin belly armor to anti-tank fire from defenders who held every angle. Infantry advancing without tank support was slaughtered by German machine guns positioned with interlocking fields of fire across each field. The offensive ground to a halt in a bloody stalemate that cost thousands of American lives for gains measured in yards rather than miles. The German commanders, who observed the American struggles in the bocage during June and early July, briefly allowed themselves to hope that the pattern might hold. Perhaps the lesson of Kasserine would repeat itself in France. Perhaps the Americans would prove unable to solve a tactical problem that required improvisation and adaptation rather than simple material superiority and firepower. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding all German forces in the West from his headquarters in France, developed a strategy based on this assumption. He would screen off the British sector around Caen, where Montgomery's methodical set-piece attacks could be predicted days in advance and prepared for accordingly, while concentrating his mobile reserves against the Americans, where the terrain so strongly favored the German defense. The strategy might have worked against a different enemy with less capacity for rapid institutional learning. It did not work against the Americans of 1944. Across the American sector of Normandy, units began independently developing solutions to the hedgerow problem without waiting for orders or guidance from higher headquarters. Tank crews welded steel teeth cut from German beach obstacles littering the Normandy coast onto their hulls, creating improvised devices that could tear through the earthen banks at ground level rather than climbing over them. Infantry squads developed entirely new tactics for clearing each field systematically, coordinating with tanks and artillery in sequences that existing doctrine had never specified because no one had anticipated this exact problem. Engineers experimented with explosive charges, demolitions, and various mechanical solutions. The solutions spread laterally from unit to unit through informal networks of communication without waiting for approval from division or corps headquarters. The American military culture not only tolerated this grassroots improvisation outside official channels, it actively encouraged innovation at every level. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 2nd Armored Division created the most famous innovation of the Normandy campaign, using scrap steel salvaged from the German beach obstacles that Rommel had ordered placed along the invasion coast. He fashioned prongs that allowed Sherman tanks to burst through hedgerows at ground level rather than climbing over them and presenting their vulnerable undersides to German anti-tank weapons. General Omar Bradley saw a demonstration of the device and immediately ordered mass production. Within 3 weeks, 3 out of 5 tanks in 1st Army mounted hedgerow cutters fabricated by ordnance units working around the clock. The device was kept strictly secret from German intelligence to maximize surprise when the breakout offensive finally came. Operation Cobra launched on July 25, 1944, with a demonstration of American combined arms power that left German survivors in permanent shock. Approximately 1,500 heavy bombers dropped their loads in a carefully planned carpet bombing pattern on a rectangle, roughly 3.5 miles long and 1.5 miles deep, saturating the target area with high explosives and fragmentation bombs. The Panzerlehr Division, one of the finest armored formations in the entire German military with cadres of experienced veterans, lay directly in the center of the impact zone. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzerlehr, would later write 20 separate manuscripts as a prisoner of war describing in clinical detail what happened to his elite division on that single catastrophic day. The bombing killed over 1,000 German soldiers from Panzerlehr alone in a matter of hours, with many more wounded and countless vehicles destroyed. When the dazed survivors emerged from their shattered positions to face the American ground assault, they found that they no longer commanded an effective fighting force capable of coordinated resistance. Panzerlehr, which had approximately 45 armored vehicles operational before the bombardment, now had only 7 tanks still capable of movement. Bayerlein reported afterward that no campaign in history could approach the Battle of Annihilation in France in 1944 in the magnitude of planning, the logic of execution, the seamless collaboration of sea, air, and ground forces, the bulk of captured equipment, or the hordes of prisoners taken. The breakthrough at Cobra opened the door for exactly the kind of sweeping mobile warfare that German generals had believed only they possessed the skill and audacity to conduct. Patton's Third Army poured through the gap blown in the German line and swept across France in an offensive that covered more ground in less time than any comparable operation in the history of warfare. German commanders watched in disbelief as American armored columns appeared behind their defensive positions, cutting communications, overrunning supply depots, trapping entire formations before they could organize orderly retreats to new defensive lines. The encirclement at the Falaise Pocket in August of 1944 destroyed the German Seventh Army as an effective fighting force and eliminated any German hope of stabilizing the front in France. Approximately 60,000 German soldiers were trapped in a shrinking perimeter under continuous attack from ground forces on all sides and air power that struck relentlessly whenever visibility permitted. 10,000 German soldiers died in the pocket. 50,000 surrendered when escape became impossible and further resistance pointless. General Heinrich von Luttwitz of the 2nd Panzer Division surveyed the carnage afterward and described the scene in terms approaching horror. Mountains of vehicles, dead horses, and dead soldiers were scattered over the road, and they increased in number by the hour. Eisenhower walked the battlefield 2 days after the pocket finally closed and wrote that the scenes could be described only by Dante. It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. The German commanders who had dismissed American fighting quality at Kasserine now struggled in their reports and later interrogations to explain what had happened in France. General Heinz Guderian, Germany's foremost theorist of armored warfare and the man who had developed the blitzkrieg concepts that conquered France in 1940, was interrogated after the war about his professional assessment of American operations. "I hear much about General Patton." Guderian admitted to his interrogators, and he conducted a good campaign from the standpoint of a tank specialist. "I must congratulate him on his victory, since he acted as I would have done had I been in his place and facing similar circumstances." Coming from Guderian, the acknowledged master of mechanized warfare, this was extraordinary professional praise. Alfred Jodl, chief of operations at German Supreme Headquarters throughout the war, was more blunt in his assessment of the strategic consequences. "The war was already lost in the West," he confessed during his captivity, "at the time of the breakthrough and the beginning of the war of movement in France. The German army that had been so confident facing Americans at Kasserine had been broken beyond hope of recovery in Normandy. The Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944 was Hitler's final desperate attempt to reverse this verdict through one massive surprise offensive. He assembled the last strategic reserves of the German military, including elite SS Panzer divisions that had been carefully rebuilt after their mauling in France, and launched them against what intelligence indicated was the weakest sector of the Allied line in the Ardennes forest. The offensive was premised partly on the assumption that American soldiers would crumble under determined surprise assault, as they had at Kasserine nearly 2 years before. Hitler still believed the Americans were fundamentally soft, still unable to withstand the shock of sudden German attack by veteran formations. The Ardennes offensive achieved complete tactical surprise when it struck on December 16th. German forces attacked through fog and snow that grounded Allied aircraft and negated American air superiority. The initial assault shattered thinly held American positions along a front of 50 miles and sent shockwaves through Allied command structures all the way back to Eisenhower's headquarters. But what happened in the days that followed demonstrated how thoroughly and irreversibly the American military had transformed since those dark days in Tunisia. At Lanzerath Ridge, 22 American soldiers held a critical position against overwhelming odds. 18 men from 1st Lieutenant Lyle Bouck's Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment, 99th Infantry Division, joined by 4 forward artillery observers from Battery C of the 371st Field Artillery Battalion, faced approximately 500 German paratroopers from the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment. These were Wehrmacht paratroopers, elite soldiers of the Luftwaffe, formidable opponents by any measure. The Americans held their isolated position through repeated costly assaults for nearly 18 hours, disrupting the carefully planned German timetable and buying precious time for reinforcements to reach threatened sectors. When they finally withdrew after exhausting their ammunition, they had inflicted disproportionate casualties on their attackers. Decades later, the platoon would receive official recognition as the most decorated American unit of its size for a single engagement in the entire war, with members receiving the Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, and Bronze Star for their actions that day. SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Paper commanded the spearhead battle group of approximately 4,800 men that was supposed to reach the Meuse River bridges on the first day of the offensive. Instead, his advance took 36 frustrating hours just to reach the small town of Stavelot, the same distance German armored forces had covered in 9 hours during the victorious 1940 campaign through these same Ardennes forests. American engineers systematically demolished every bridge in his path. Despite the chaos of retreat, American soldiers emptied fuel depots and set them ablaze rather than let precious gasoline fall into German hands. Every delay cost Paper irreplaceable time and fuel he could not afford. At Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions established positions and completely blocked the entire 6th SS Panzer Army, the main effort of the German offensive containing some of the finest remaining formations in the Wehrmacht. The 1st Infantry Division held the critical southern flank at Dom-Butgenbach, while the 9th Infantry Division anchored the northern sector near Monschau. Together, these 4 divisions created a defensive line that the Germans could not break. Infantry bazooka teams stalked and destroyed German armored vehicles at close quarters in the forests. American artillery massed its fire with devastating effect. The 12th SS Panzer Division, which had confidently expected to lead the breakthrough to Antwerp and victory, was so badly mauled in its repeated attacks that it never regained combat effectiveness as a formation. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded by overwhelming German forces that demanded its surrender to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. The defense included not just the paratroopers, but also Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, the 75th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and remnants of other shattered units that had retreated into the perimeter. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, temporarily commanding the division, considered the German ultimatum briefly and responded with a single word that would become legendary in American military history: nuts. His defenders held their shrinking perimeter through days of bitter fighting in freezing conditions until Patton's Third Army executed one of the greatest logistical and tactical feats of the entire war, pivoting an entire army of over 100,000 men 90 degrees northward and advancing over 100 miles through winter conditions to relieve the siege on December 26th. Winston Churchill addressed the House of Commons in January of 1945 and spoke of the battle with unusual generosity toward the American ally. Care must be taken in telling our proud tale not to claim for the British Army an undue share of what is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, Churchill declared, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. The Battle of the Bulge consumed Germany's last strategic reserves of men and equipment and proved beyond any remaining doubt that American forces had matured into one of the most formidable fighting organizations on Earth. The contrast with German assessments of British forces illuminates what made the Americans distinctively feared rather than merely respected. German officers consistently described the British with professional respect, but without the same edge of anxiety that colored their discussions of American capabilities. The British were professional soldiers who knew their trade. The British were competent in their planning and execution. The British were methodical in their approach to operations, and the British were above all predictable in ways that made German defensive planning straightforward. Montgomery's operations in Normandy and afterward followed recognizable patterns that German intelligence could anticipate and prepare countermeasures against. Massive logistical buildup visible through aerial reconnaissance for days before any attack, overwhelming preliminary bombardment providing hours of advance warning that the assault was imminent. Then, infantry and armor advancing according to set-piece doctrine that had been refined but not fundamentally changed since the desert campaigns of North Africa. German commanders felt they understood how British offensives would unfold. They could predict the timing, identify the objectives, and prepare their defenses accordingly. Field Marshal von Rundstedt admitted in his post-war debriefing that his entire strategy in Normandy was to screen off the British with minimum forces while concentrating mobile reserves against the Americans. The terrain around Caen was admittedly more suitable for armored defense, but the fundamental reason was that the British approach gave the Germans more time to react while Americans attacked with less warning and exploited opportunities with frightening speed. He knew what the British would do before they did it. He was never certain what the Americans would do until they were already doing it. This comparison requires important context that German officers often omitted from their post-war assessments when they were trying to explain their defeats. The British deliberately drew the heaviest German formations toward themselves in Normandy. According to Montgomery's operational plan, British and Canadian forces were specifically tasked with pinning down German armor around Caen, while Americans prepared the breakout from the bocage country further west. 6 of the 7 panzer divisions committed to Normandy were concentrated against the British and Canadian sector, including the formidable Panzer Lehr and the fanatical 12th SS. British caution was partly a rational tactical response to facing the strongest German opposition on ground that heavily favored armored defense. British manpower constraints also shaped operational doctrine in ways German critics ignored. Having fought continuously for 2 years longer than the Americans, with the mass trauma of Somme and Passchendaele casualties still fresh in national memory, Britain simply could not sustain the same casualty rates as the larger American force. Conservative tactics that husbanded manpower were strategic prudence rather than timidity. The German assessments of American forces that emerged from the war were not simple fear of individual American soldiers in personal combat. What Germans genuinely feared was the American system that multiplied individual performance, the artillery that could mass hundreds of guns on a single target within minutes, the air power that made daylight movement suicidal for any German formation, the logistics that kept ammunition and fuel and replacements flowing in quantities that seemed inexhaustible, the organizational culture that learned from every failure and adapted faster than German planners believed any army could adapt. By the spring of 1945, the consequences of these systemic differences were visible across the shattered landscape of Germany itself. American forces had crossed the Rhine in strength at multiple points. German cities burned under continuous bombing that no longer faced effective opposition. The factories that had produced the Wehrmacht's weapons lay in ruins that would take years to rebuild. The strategic reserves of men and equipment were completely exhausted. The fuel supply that any modern army required was depleted beyond recovery. German soldiers fought on with characteristic stubborn courage, but they fought without hope or any realistic prospect of reversing their defeat. The men who had fought from Kasserine to the Rhine went home to ordinary lives when the war finally ended. The soldiers who had broken under Rommel's first assault and the soldiers who had held at Elsenborn Ridge and Bastogne were often the same men, transformed beyond recognition by experience and training and the institutional capacity of their army to learn from failure rather than repeat mistakes. They did not think of themselves as having done anything extraordinary. They had simply done what was asked of them, adapting and improving, until they became something their enemies genuinely feared. German commanders who survived the war and wrote their memoirs struggled to explain how the transformation had happened so quickly. They had been correct about the Americans at Kasserine. The soldiers they faced in February of 1943 really were inexperienced and poorly led and incapable of standing against veteran German formations. But they had been catastrophically wrong about what those same soldiers could become in a matter of months rather than years. They had measured American potential by American performance in the early stages of the war and concluded that substantial improvement would require extended time they would not have. The improvement came faster than any German model predicted. The factories that built the weapons have mostly been closed or converted to peaceful purposes. The soldiers who carried those weapons into battle have largely passed into history as the generation that fought the war grows smaller each year. The conflict they waged ended 8 decades ago. But the evidence of what happened remains preserved in archives and memoirs and interrogation transcripts for anyone willing to examine it carefully. The German officers who faced American forces left detailed assessments behind because their captors asked them to explain what they had experienced and why they had lost. They described what they observed and what they feared. They explained in their own words why the Americans were different from anyone else they had fought. The Americans they met at Kasserine were not the Americans who broke the Wehrmacht in Normandy and the Bulge. The army that fled in February of 1943 became the army that no German force could stop by the summer of 1944. That transformation happened because the American military built integrated systems that multiplied individual effectiveness far beyond what raw skill alone could achieve. It happened because American culture treated failure as a learning opportunity rather than a permanent judgment on capability. It happened because ordinary men from farms and factories and cities across a vast continent proved capable of extraordinary growth and achievement when circumstances demanded their best. They were not supermen with abilities beyond normal human capacity. They were simply people who rose to meet an extraordinary challenge when their moment of testing arrived. And in doing so, they gave the German army, which had conquered most of Europe and seemed invincible, a reason to be genuinely afraid. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. Your support helps us continue sharing important stories from the Second World War that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to join our community of history enthusiasts from around the world. We would love to hear from you in the comments whether you have family connections to this history or simply appreciate learning about the past. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive for future generations.